Hello and welcome to Books and Us, the podcast about learning about new ideas and getting inspiration from books. I'm Ranjit Monga, and every week I talk to authors of books in the non-fiction category, from which we can get a wealth of knowledge and information. If you would like to read about the podcast interviews, you can visit the website www.globalbihari.com and search for the column Literary Speaking.
The reason that it is termed the most magnificent palace in the East, perhaps in the world, is for multiple reasons. One is, of course, that the individual buildings were, in terms of their proportion, their detailing, their decoration, there was something that overawed most people who encountered them. But the entire fort functioned as a whole. And the fort in the social, economic, and political context of that time was actually many things.
So, welcome back to the second season of the podcast Books and Us. In fact, today is the second episode of the second season, and we are back again with a very interesting topic. In fact, we are going to talk about a monument today, that is the Red Fort. And the book is The Red Fort of Shahjahanabad, an Architectural History. The Red Fort or the Lal Killa, situated in North Delhi, was built by Shah Jahan, which has remained a symbol of power and authority for the last few centuries. The book is a spatial and architectural history of the Red Fort, which was built in the 17th century. The book also talks about the area around the Red Fort, which is today known as the Walled City or Old Delhi. This book had first come out in 2002 and has recently been released with new research. The author of the book is Anisha Shekhar Mukherji. Welcome to the podcast, Anisha.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Ranjit.
Anisha is an architect with specialization in conservation. She works as an independent designer, researcher, and conservation consultant, and is the author of significant books on India's history, culture, and architecture. In this book, she has unveiled the social, economic, political, and familial context of the landmark construction that is the Red Fort and the city around it. So, Anisha, can you explain further what the book is all about?
Yes, Ranjit. Well, the book is essentially about making sense of the fort, of the Red Fort. And the reason I wrote it is that when I first visited the fort, which was when I was doing my architectural training, and when I visited the Red Fort, I couldn't figure out how the Mughal emperor or anybody else for that matter lived inside the fort, because what I saw didn't make sense. And then I started looking for information which would help me to understand this. And I found that there was no one source or book which could explain this to me. And then, I started to research on the fort. And the book is therefore, it's a culmination of that research and analysis that I did. And it traces the life of the Red Fort. The objective is to explain the original design and form and function of the fort, which is very difficult for us to understand today because there's very little of it that exists of the original design. So it also places the Red Fort into context, in the context of the geographical area that it's situated in, as well as the larger social and political context of the subcontinent. Then but it doesn't just stop at the past of the fort. It explains what the fort means to us in the present, and therefore what we need to do in the future with what we have remaining of the fort. So it's all of that.
Yeah, that's a lot on the plate. And I have a special interest in this subject because, as I was mentioning to you, after I did my MA in history and I had signed up for a MPhil in architectural history, the architectural history of the forts of the Persian and Mughal era and how they sort of corresponded with the socio-economic and political conditions in that era. And your book was like a godsend. After so many years, I was able to read and satisfy myself a little bit about social, political, and economic history of Mughals, as reflected in their architecture. So you have described that the Red Fort, especially the imperial residences inside the Red Fort, where the emperor used to stay, was the most magnificent palace in the East and perhaps in the world in the 17th century. So, what exactly do you mean when you say this, and how does it reflect the socioeconomic condition in that time?
Well, you see, this is a quote that I use, and it's a quote which is by Ferguson, by James Ferguson, who is a pioneering architectural historian, as you'd know. And he said this when he came across the remains of the Red Fort in the mid 19th century, and he was somebody who had traveled and written extensively about architecture and specifically forts as well. So the reason that it is termed the most magnificent palace in the East, perhaps in the world, is for multiple reasons. One is, of course, that the individual buildings were, in terms of their proportion, their detailing, their decoration, they were they were something that overawed most people who encountered them. But the entire fort functioned as a whole. So it's not just one building or two buildings, but it's a sequence of spaces that leads up to the different important buildings. And the Red Fort is therefore, again, the normal conception of a fortress is that it's for either defensive or offensive purposes. And the fort in the social, economic, and political context of that time was actually many things. So the Red Fort is, it contained, of course, the palace of the emperor and his family. It also contained administrative sections, the Mughal military, then karkhanas, gardens, the service sector, all of that. And the experience of entering the fort, right from the time you entered the fort through its public gateways, they were all very coherently knit together through a series of large courtyards that increased in size and grandeur, and a succession of gateways as you came closer and closer to the emperor's his throne. So the entire cumulative effect, I think, was what impressed everybody. The fact that it was a very ordered succession of spaces that went into making a composite whole. So each individual building was, of course, magnificent. So therefore, in its heyday, it was a very impressive sight, because it was conceived as a complete experience. And there's something that I think we should also appreciate about the fort and the city, which is something, again, that James Ferguson was responding to when he termed it the most magnificent palace in the East, perhaps in the world, was that this was planned and executed as an entire exercise. So the contemporary city of Shahjahanabad and the Red Fort were built simultaneously. They were thought of as being connected, and they didn't come up with successive rulers. Like, this is what happens in a lot of historical palaces and towns. It's like one venture, so it's conceived as a whole, and then it's implemented as a whole. So therefore, it's a very dramatic and impressive spectacle, because of the fact that it's designed and built with a certain effect in mind. And then because Shah Jahan, who was the ruler who commissioned the fort and city, and he's arguably one of the richest rulers in the world at that time, and he commanded a lot of resources, power, skills. You had some of the best craftspeople in the entire subcontinent together to make the fort. So, so therefore, it's also representative of his design sensibilities and those of all these people who worked on the fort. So all that then went into making it such an impressive spectacle. And I like to call it the grand finale of the Mughal forts, just like the Taj Mahal, which is also Shah Jahan's very important act of patronage. It's like the grand finale to the imperial tombs. So Similarly, the Red Fort is the grand finale to imperial
Mm.
Mughal forts, which,
Mm.
in themselves were something which were quite a spectacle.
When you talk about the total experience of the spaces when you enter the fort, for example, from the western side, the Lohri Gate, and I believe that there was a direct access right from Diwane Am to the entrances to what is today known as Chandni Chowk and then Fatehpuri Masjid, and so people entering from that side of the kingdom could have that experience.
Yes, that's right. So most people who probably listening to the podcast have also
Mm.
been to the Red Fort and they're aware
Mhm.
of the gate entrance. But just to orient us again,
Mm.
the fort has two principal public entrances. One
Mm.
is the Lahori Gate and the other is the Delhi Gate.
Mm.
And the Lahori Gate is the one that is in direct access to the Diwan-e-Am, where
Mm.
the Jharokai Darshan, where the emperor, it's the hall of public audience, and that's his throne
Mm.
where he comes every day and sits
Mm.
and dispenses justice. And this was in direct access with the main urban street
Mm. Okay.
of Shahjahanabad.
Mm.
And again, this is in a sense, it's in defiance of the normal entrance sequences to forts and palaces, because where considerations of defense are such
Mhm.
that there is actually a staggered entrance, but
Mhm.
here it was a direct entrance, a
Mm.
visual entrance that was
Mm.
direct, a
Mm.
spatial entrance as well,
Mm.
a spatial
Mm.
access.
Mm.
And so what it means is that if you were standing at Fatehpur Sikri, sorry,
Mm.
at Fatehpuri Masjid, and
Mm.
you looked back at the fort and you saw it looming ahead,
Mm.
you could, in principle, you were in direct line of sight with
With
the
the
emperor.
emperor, yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
And then as you
Mm.
proceeded again, it was like in a sense, it was like a stage set. So,
Mm.
you proceeded through this very, very important urban
Mm.
street,
Mm.
which had a canal and which had gardens on
Mm.
both sides, as
Mm.
well as, very
Mm.
important
Mm.
shops.
Mm.
And you, it was punctuated by chalks, by
Mm.
larger forecourts.
Mm.
And as you became closer and closer to the fort, the size of the chalks increased.
Mm.
And then finally, when you reached the walls of the fort,
Mm.
there used to be, there's a moat there, but there was a drawbridge, and during
Mm.
the daylight hours, it was open, and you
Mm.
walked through it. Of course, there were guards
Mm.
there, but you could, you could go straight through. And then the access of the Chatta Bazaar, which is a covered market.
Mm.
Again, that led you straight through another series of courtyards in the fort. Finally, it culminated in the Diwan-e-Am. So, and as you kept proceeding further and further inwards, as I said, the forecourts kept getting larger and larger and more magnificent,
More
because
grandiose. Mm.
yes, and we also have to remember that these would have been decorated with awnings, and
Mm.
there would be canards and
Mm.
rich brocades,
Mm.
and the gateways were right before the Diwaniyam. You had the Naubat Khana, the Nakkar Khana,
Mm.
where you also
Mm.
had music. So there was also this audio
Yeah,
component.
and
So it was an audio
musicians sitting
experience.
on the first floor and playing music all day.
Yes, you get the sense that yes, there's
Mm.
something very special that you're approaching,
Mm.
but there is no barrier
Mm.
to a resident of the city and to the
Mm.
emperor. And this also reflects the style of governance of the
Okay,
Mughals,
Shah
who
Jahan.
portrayed
Yeah.
themselves as king and father. Yeah, so
Mm.
that's the kind of relationship
Mm.
that was supposed to be there between the ruler and his people. He's likened to a father, even throughout, even till the time of Bahadur Shah Zafar. So it's a close relationship that's reflected in the architecture.
And that spoke volumes about the grandeur of the Mughal court, and also the fact that with Shah Jahan, the empire was at its peak.
And there's also a level of self-confidence, in the
Mm.
fact that
Mm.
you're dispensing with
Mm.
with those barriers that normally you
Mm.
have in forts and palaces of not giving a direct entrance. And the walls that we see today are a later addition. They're by Aurangzeb, and Shah Jahan is then supposed to have written to him, "Dear son, you made the fort a bride and put a veil upon her face."
Yeah, when Aurangzeb built that additional gate.
Yes, so it's like a veil,
Mm.
it hides the
Mm.
fort from
Mm.
the
Mm.
city. and vice versa.
Okay, and also I was amazed to read about the entire layout of the buildings, rather the arcades, the pavilions, the gardens, the pavilions within the gardens, and that you described as like a grid, and which had a tradition in the world. So what was that grid along on which lines the entire layout was, the entire construction was made?
Yes. So now again, you see, all of this has to be it has to be researched and surmised from what we have remaining. And
Mhm,
the the buildings, the Mughal buildings on site today, they're very
mhm,
few and they seem
mhm,
very scattered. So I did a series of geometrical studies
mhm,
and spatial analysis, correlating that to textual as well as visual records that I could find.
mhm,
And there is a very definite geometry that the fort is governed by. So, if you look at the overall fort, the plan is it's like a wedge-shaped rectangle. If you break it down, and you see that there is there's what is called a Musamman Baghdadi, which is it's an octagon where the emperor's field of operations fits into that. And that is there's a series of grids, there are a series of grids which is based on, each grid is 100 gus, and the fort is divided based on that, and the main buildings in the fort are located based on that grid. But what is very interesting is that it's not just these buildings. So the experience, as I mentioned, the experience of the fort and what made it so magnificent is that these buildings are part of a larger experience where you're moving through open areas and into covered areas. And there's a
mhm,
relationship between the open areas and the covered areas. The open areas are essentially forecourts and
mhm,
gardens, and in
mhm,
some cases, streets.
mhm,
Now, these forecourts also, their proportions are related
mhm,
to this overall grid, these different parts that were there,
mhm,
which were ranging from pavilions to gateways to forecourts to gardens to streets to tanks. All of them had this underlying geometry which
mhm,
knit them together. And so what happens is that when we move through any architectural space, we of course respond in terms of what we see and what we can touch. But if there's this inner harmony in
mhm,
the way in which the buildings are connected, then it takes the experience to a different level, which you
mhm,
may or may not register,
mhm,
in a very uh, tangible way, but it makes for a experience that's very harmonious. But what's very, very ingenious is that this grid is not sacrosanct.
mhm,
So the most important thing is, how does a building respond to the site? And if you look at where the Red Fort is, there is an older fort that existed there, which is Salimgarh. And that is about 100 years before the fort. It was established by Salim Shah Suri, who was, in fact, a political rival of the Mughals. And it's strategically a very, very important fort because it occupies a junction of various routes, whether it's Grand Trunk route or
mhm,
south, the Mathura Road axis or the Yamuna River. So this Salimgarh was an island fort. And the
mhm,
Red Fort is the site that is chosen for it is right next to Salimgarh.
mhm,
And then there is a certain piece of land which is included within the fort's boundaries. So then it doesn't appear symmetrical anymore.
mhm,
And this piece of land then and the fort boundaries on that edge, they respond to the profile of Salimgarh. So in
mhm,
effect, what you're doing is that you are attaching Salimgarh to this new fort,
mhm,
and the new fort's plan form is getting it's responding to Salimgarh as much as to this notion of having a bilateral symmetrical plan. And I think that's really very smart, because what you're doing is that you're utilizing existing
mhm,
infrastructure. There are these different domains in the fort that, I mean, I call them
mhm,
different domains. They're different parts of the fort. The emperor's domain, which is his private imperial domain, which consists of his palaces and his gardens, is confined to this very ordered, symmetrical part of the fort. And this additional portion that is added on, there you have a lot of the service sector. So you have stables, military, etc.
So this is the area,
And
the Khas Mahal, right? The emperor's residence.
well, yeah, the Khas Mahal is part of the emperor's residence. So let me,
Okay.
I'll very quickly kind of,
Mm,
you know,
mm,
orient
mm.
you. So
Yeah.
if you look at the fort and the
Mm,
Lahori gate, which is the gate that we're all familiar with, which is where we
mm,
enter from,
mm,
that is essentially the western face
mm,
of the fort. The eastern face of the fort, which is towards the Yamuna River and which
mm,
overlooks it, and which is therefore furthest from this public gateway, is
mm,
where the emperor's
mm,
own palace, those of his family are. So
mm,
they're furthest away from this public gateway.
mm,
And that's where his Khas Mahal is
mm,
also the,
mm,
where he stays. Not just that,
mm,
there are other important buildings over there, including the
mm,
Diwan-e Khas, which is a hall of
mm,
private audience. There
mm,
is the Rang Mahal, which is it's like a
mm,
reception hall where the emperor
mm,
listens to music
mm,
and interacts with his family and his harem. And there are the hammams are there, the palaces of Jahanara and the royal women are there.
mm,
And
mm,
all of these are they're in a line, in a sense, they're like strung on this
mm,
raised terrace,
mm.
which runs the entire face of the entire length of the eastern face,
Eastern
and which
face,
is
yeah.
which is perfectly symmetrical. If you were a resident of Shahjahanabad,
Mm,
every morning you would have the opportunity to go to the river bank
mm,
and look at this eastern face of the fort and get darshan of the Badshah.
yeah.
So the emperor would come out on his balcony, which
Mm,
was this octagonal balcony
mm,
linked to his Khas Mahal.
mm,
And he would sit in audience and, he would display himself and people could intercede directly
mm,
if they wanted to be heard. So, he's seeing his populace and being seen by them. So it's like a point of contact. And this Khas Mahal is again a very, very interesting, well, it's not just a building. I would call it, a set of buildings really, because all the buildings in the fort, they follow what I call the pavilion typology, which is something that is both it was in the Indic tradition as well. So if you read classical texts on architecture, and the definition of buildings includes pavilions and halls. So they're very much a part of what is described as buildings. And of course, the Mughals with their with Babur coming in from Central Asia and
mm,
their very nomadic kind of
mm,
existence, pavilions and tents are very much a part of their life,
mm,
encamped
mm,
cities almost.
mm,
So the Khas Mahal, it integrates all these influences
mm,
and it responds to the particular location and climate of
mm.
where it is situated.
Yeah, the
So
climate of Delhi and surrounding areas had a special bearing on all these gardens and the
yes,
orchards and the kind of plants. And of course, the Basis,
Bahesh, the Nehre Bahesh, yes.
the
So the
Nehre
Nehru
Basis.
Bahesh is this channel. It's like the river of
Yeah,
paradise.
yeah.
So it flows through this entire eastern
Mm,
terrace that I was talking about, where the
mm,
emperor's own palaces are disposed, as well as those
mm,
of his family. And then finally, it terminates at the other end of this eastern face, where you have a tower called the Asad Burj. So the eastern terrace of the fort is terminated by two towers. One is the Shah Burj and one is the Asad Burj. There is another tower here, which is
mm,
the Musamman Burj, which used to
mm,
be a gold-plated tower,
mm,
and where the emperor, as I mentioned, gave public audience. And behind this is his set of rooms.
mm,
And this is a very ingenious interpretation of the pavilion because it's the place where he sleeps, where he rests, he needs privacy. So
mm,
it can't be an open pavilion.
mm,
And what it does is that it actually has a set of more or less solid rooms on the eastern and the western face, which are the
mm,
more public areas. But overlooking the terrace, where the Nahar-e Bahesh flows on both sides,
mm,
on those two sides, it's like a veranda on both
mm,
sides. And but there's this very famous screen of justice with this beautifully carved screen, which separates these two verandas. So the water flows through the space, but you can't actually traverse through them. You have to go through the room. So, so there's this entire theme running through the fort where everything looks very open, and there is this great sense of space flowing in. But there are these devices which ensure that you only move in a certain way to ensure security for the emperor. And therefore, the emperor could use these in multiple ways. The water flows through, so it's a beautiful sight to behold. And it cools the place. The floors are in marble. The kind of decoration that is used here, there's ainakari. So, there's this glass which is inset in the plaster, and these beautiful patterns. There are semi-precious stones that are set in the walls. So all in all, it's a very beautiful space to be in. From every point of view, what you see, what you experience, what you smell, because there are gardens outside. So, the flowers, the scent of the flowers comes in. The Yamuna is across, so that has its own microclimate. And you remember the Yamuna was not like it is today.
Yeah, must be
It was a
much bigger. Yeah.
very wide, very expansive, very close to the fort, with green fields beyond. So a beautiful sight to see. There are, it had a lot of animal life. There are crocodiles and fish and all the rest of it. And then the Nahari Bahesh also, it traverses before it comes to the emperor's Khwabga and his Khas Mahal. It moves through the boundaries of his gardens, the Hayat Baksh. And there are other gardens, all through. So it's a very refined and evolved experience.
So, okay, can you describe, for example, how magnificent, say, for example, Divane Aam and Divane Khas were, and what were the elements, the decorative elements, and which are no longer there?
Yeah, so today when you see the Divane Aam and the Divane Khas, it's very difficult to imagine what they were earlier, because most of the decorative elements are not there. Many of them they were looted at various times of the fort's history, and the most recent was, of course, 1857, after which things like semi-precious stones from the walls were gouged out, entire marble panels were uprooted. Not just that, then the buildings were then used for very inappropriate purposes, because the British moved into the fort and used it as a garrison fort. And what we see today is the outcome of a conservation exercise that was conducted in the beginning of the 20th century. So it's really very difficult to get a sense of the kind of magnificence that was there then. What remains is, of course, the proportions, and the building elements. And those are still, they have a lot of grace as well as gravitas. I'll tell you this little incident when on one of my visits to the fort, I was standing next to the Divane Aam. I think I was taking some measurements, taking some photographs. And there was this group of Rajasthani villagers, very arresting in their pagdis and everything. And they were talking to each other, men and women. And one of them said, he said, the Divane Aam today is, you see it as a red sandstone building. And he said, ये लाल किला इसीलिए बोलते हैं. This is why it's called the Red Fort, because of this red building.
But actually, I think it was made of white plaster, which shone like marble.
It was the sandstone that we see was covered in these
Covered.
layers of fine chunam, which is said to rival marble. And so much so that a lot of visitors got fooled and thought it was a marble building, because, it was so skillfully done. And so not just that, then as we see the buildings today, we kind of see them unclothed. So these pavilions, they had kannats and awnings that were stretched out from them. So the space, the actual space of the pavilion, the usable space was increased, because you had this added shaded edge to it. Visually also, you would have had these very richly worked cloth, whether in brocade or velvet, which was attached to the pavilion. Then there were carpets that were hung carpets that were laid. There were railings of silver and gold, and a lot of the painted decoration on the ceiling. All of that. Not just that. So the individual building, as I'm telling you, it had many more layers of decoration, both on the structure as well as attached to the structure. But beyond that, the building didn't sit by itself. So today we see the Divan-e-Aam and the Divan-e-Khas uh, just sitting all alone by themselves.
Yes.
But initially, they would have had these connecting colonnades that ran all around them. And today they're like amputated. So again, you can't get a sense of the magnificence because you don't have the surroundings in which to view them properly. So that's one aspect of it, the fact that its surroundings are gone. Second aspect, as I said, is that it's been reworked. And also the skills, you see, they were very, very highly skilled people during the time of the Mughal emperors. They were patrons of the craftspeople. And in fact, the court histories record how during the inauguration ceremonies of the fort, which were held in the Divan-e-Aam, and the Divan-e-Aam is described most magnificently, the special cloth that was got from Gujarat for making the kanats and the awnings at that time. There were these pillars of that were painted over in gold and all of that. But what is also interesting, and I think very, very important to note, is that the emperor actually honors these craftspeople at the public gathering at the inauguration of the fort. So there was this entire culture of supporting very high craft skills, which again we don't do anymore. So even when there have been conservation efforts at the fort right from the beginning of the 20th century, which have tried to get back some of the original scheme of decoration, it's not like the original at all. Because, as I said, those skills don't exist anymore. So that's how, when you see the Divan-e-Aam and Divan-e-Khas today, it's difficult to reconcile the descriptions in the court histories with, the way they stand today. Because, as I said, the proportions are still very beautiful. The structure is still, you can see how well detailed it is. But all of this is removed.
In the book, also you say that, and I'm quoting from your book, the fort may be likened to a large book whose seemingly intact hardbound cover is moth-eaten around the edges. When you turn the cover, you discover that most pages inside are missing. So you have also said that around 85%, 80% of the buildings are no longer there, and they have fallen prey to subsequent destruction and invasions by different raiders. So before we come to the conservation part, I want to just ask you that how the decline of the empire, because I think after Aurangzeb, the empire started to decline. How does that reflect? How did that reflect in the architecture?
Well, it reflects directly in many ways. One is that Aurangzeb actually, after the initial some years, does not inhabit the fort because he moves out on wars of conquest. And the Mughal empire was structured in a way that wherever the emperor was, the court was there, and all the activities were centered around his person and his influence. So what this meant is that the Red Fort continued to be occupied by members of the royal family. The emperor himself, because he's not there anymore. So naturally, you don't have that kind of concentration of attention or activity over there. So the fort, I don't know if I mentioned this before, it's not just the residence of the emperor, but it also functions as the cultural and the economic center of the city. It's a place that's karkhanas where the best craftspeople come. Because the emperor is there, people from different parts of the country also congregate to the city and to the fort to show their work and be employed. The fort also is a place that uses a lot of the manufactured products, and they're all made by hand, remember, in that time. So one is that there's a reduction in that. And then after Aurangzeb, Aurangzeb's son also Bahadur Shah I does not enter Delhi as emperor. It's only after him that the Mughal emperors again start residing within the Red Fort. Then again, there are a lot of the ancillary activities that are revived, but that then is coinciding with the time that the political power is decreasing. So, and then of course, there is still a lot of wealth, but one very, very low point is when Nadir Shah invades Shahjahanabad. There's a lot of destruction, a lot of decimation, a lot of things are carried away, a lot of, including crafts people. And then the fort and the city recover from that. But naturally, there has been a reduction in the both the aura of the emperor, the political control, as well as the finances and the amount of money that he has. But the real turning point, I think, comes with the with 1857 and its aftermath, because you see, before that, what happens is that there is a neglect of existing structures. There is less of newer architecture being commissioned, and there is a reduction in the formality of a lot of the spaces, because you have some ad hoc insertions. So there is crowding, there is neglect, there's all of that, but there is still, the fort is a cultural center. And the relationship between the city and the fort is still very, very active. There are mushairas held in the fort where people come, the emperor and his family go out to the city, participate in various cultural activities. But it is after 1857 that you have wholesale destruction of the fort. And the way we see the fort today is a direct outcome of that. Because before that, you had various people, marauders and raiders. They came, they destroyed, they looted, they left. The difference is that the British looted and stayed on. And so continued to wreak havoc on the fort, because some of it was, of course, destroyed in the fighting and the battles of 1857. But a lot of the destruction of the fort happened a couple of years later as a very, very deliberate act to say that we are erasing all record of the, not just the people who stayed there, but also the way of life that they followed. So after 1857, in fact, both the fort, I mean, of course, Bahadur Shah Zafar and the remaining members of his family who were allowed to live were sent to Rangoon, as you know. The rest of them were hanged or killed. And a lot of the male population of the city had also been killed during the battles and afterwards. And then the entire city had been turned out of Shahjahanabad so that the looting could happen in a uninterrupted way.
Yeah,
And so
even in the areas where the local citizens stayed, right?
yes, of course, everybody. So they were all turned out, and then when they were allowed to come back after close to a year or so, then parts of the city were resold to them. There was also these gardens, all around the fort, public gardens. So which was a social space for the city, which was free, and it was actively patronized by people in the city. There were sarais and there were temples and mosques and all of that. And all of that was cleared. So what happened was that you not only knocked down large swathes of parts of the city and the fort, you also removed the connections between them completely. And you made certain areas out of bound. So as I mentioned, the people in the city would go to the river bank for darshan of the emperor. There were ghats further along from the Red Fort, further north and further and down south as well along the riverfront. There were public gardens around the fort, along the riverfront, on both sides of the Chandni Chowk. So all of that was changed. And so you not only changed the architecture, but you also changed the way spaces were used, the remaining spaces were used. You enforced control. So that, and in a sense, that is what continues even today. So there is this big kind of gap between the fort and the city. The fort sits like an island within these very, very busy roads. You can't really see it properly for all the interruptions that are there, whether they're barricade or traffic. And the sense of social inclusion and the cultural pivot that the fort was, for the empire as well as directly for its immediate city, all of that has got effaced. And unfortunately, we've not been able to either appreciate that or reinstate that in any way. So in a sense, it's this colonial model of interpretation of the fort, even though, some portions have been conserved, but it hasn't reflected in a renewal of these connections or in an appreciation of what the fort actually stood for. So in a sense, I'd say it's still continuing the kind of uprooting that happened in 1857 and after.
Even with all this destruction and breaking of the connection between the citizens and the fort, because you also mentioned that during 1947, during partition, new people came into that area from across the border, and the citizens living in that area, they migrated to Pakistan. So even the memory of that connection was lost. Uh,
That's right.
yeah. So, but even to this day, the you have also mentioned that the Red Fort, and we do see the signs of it, that the Red Fort still remains a symbol of power and authority for the government.
Yes, that's linked to that's linked to also the role that it played during
Mm-hmm.
1857. So
Mm-hmm.
the reason why the soldiers from Meerut ride in here and they want to meet Bahadur Shah Zafar is that for all, though his actual power might have reduced, but in terms of the um, the symbolic power that he has, that it still vests in the Mughal emperor. He's still seen as a Badshah. And in fact, the East India Company is kind of, doing a proxy rule by ruling in his name, because they also come to court, their officials, the British resident, and they present nazars to the emperor. So they kind of present themselves as vassals of the emperor, and they're playing on getting legitimacy through his name. And that's therefore they're still there, because as I mentioned, the Red Fort, after Bahadur Shah I, it is consistently inhabited by the Mughal emperors. So there is this kind of direct association it has with the rulership. And then it is a very important symbolic stronghold, which is why if you see the kind of reprisal that the British did at the Red Fort in Delhi, and the amount of destruction that uh, carried through here, it's far more than in Agra or Lahore, which are also important imperial Mughal forts. So there's definitely that connection.
And that connection continues even today to an extent, right?
Yes, yes, to a great extent, because as it's also linked to the freedom movement. So Subhash Chandra Bose, when he says Delhi Chalo, he means to the Red Fort. And then there is, the trial of the INA officers is held at the fort, and it creates a huge kind of, public anger. And then, so it's associated with both 1857 and 1947, which is why it has, very, very powerful resonances today for us as well. And, right from the entire tradition of the Independence Day speeches there and all of that. Delhi is indelibly associated with the Red Fort. It's kind of iconic. It's a definitive monument or symbol of Delhi and of the country. I also think what's happened is that because it's such a powerful symbol of our freedom struggle, that all of that has actually detracted attention from its design. And it's kind of overshadowed it. Whereas an important thing to remember is that it's one of the reasons that it became a symbol was because of the decision to make it with Shahjahanabad and the kind of design that it had. So that's something that I think is not understood at all. Therefore, a lot of the conservation efforts also, it's very interesting. And I believe for anything, you need to know the context very well. And only then can you actually devise, solutions or, let's say, implement any improvement in it. For instance, a lot of the work that's done for this, there is a lot of funds that are being given to the fort, but you will see that they're they do not recognize the inherent strengths of the fort, the qualities of the fort. So one of the things that I mentioned was the fact that you had these social spaces which were for people, and they were gardens, and these gardens were orchards. They were not, this lawn, stretches of lawn that we have
Yeah.
today. They are, for our climate and our culture, they are completely perverse and incorrect, because in a place where you have water shortage, if you have such huge stretches of lawn which are water guzzling spaces, that's a travesty, to do that. Instead, if you have trees sustain themselves over time. They actually recharge the water table instead of reducing it, and they offer social spaces to people in the city. Then they improve the microclimate, and we are in a state of a climate emergency. So the areas around the fort is what's termed a green area. But the green area was an orchard. It was not a green area which is in the British landscape of
Context.
lawn.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. And the thing is that if you have lawns, you have to keep people out, because if they walk all over the lawns, the grass will get worn out. So then these areas have fences. And then again, as I said, it's completely the opposite of what the connections, the spatial and the functional connections that the fort had with the city, because now you're barring people from them. Then in terms of, the river face, as I mentioned, again, the banks were open to the people. Today, the banks have again been interpreted as a kind of municipal garden, same concept. You have fences and you have, species of trees that are not native. So much so that there is water that gets stagnated there. And the walls of the fort, if you see, they're getting really degraded there. There's water seepage. So that's so unfortunate that, celebrating the fort, and we salute it every Independence Day. Yet when we try to conserve it, or we try to address its needs today, we actually jeopardize it. So there's a whole, it continues all through, whether it's in the amount of sandstone paving that has been laid throughout the fort, which is again, a hard surface, reflects heat, very energy intensive, to the fact that the British barracks, which were, they were made with the rubble of the destroyed Mughal buildings in the fort. Those are now, they seem to be getting more attention really than the Mughal buildings. So it kind of reverses the original attributes of the fort, which are the reason that it's celebrated. It was celebrated, and it still is. So I think that's very, very important to recognize.
So, can you encapsulate your suggestions so that, what do you think is the way forward as far as conservation is concerned, and what this fort and the connection with it of the people would mean culturally?
Yeah, so I think the most important element in conserving anything is to first understand its principles. And this is true whether you're conserving, a monument, or a kind of or something intangible like a cultural tradition. And I come back to the reason I wrote the book, which is that today most people who visit the fort, they can't understand. I presume a lot of them probably don't even be able to comprehend why it's important to conserve the fort, because as I said, there is so little of it that remains, and it is in such a reduced form. So the most important thing I think in conservation is to first communicate what is important about what you are trying to conserve. And again, that's what the book tries to do. It analyzes the fort and the city from multiple aspects, and information on the fort is very little. So again, I think one very important aspect of conservation needs to be that on site there is appropriate information that is presented in an engaging way that allows people to imagine and visualize what the fort was like. So so building up appreciation, I think, is the first aspect of conservation. The second thing, which comes from actually generating this understanding and appreciation, is then what is it that you conserve? Because you see, in our tradition, and this was the subject of my thesis as well, where I was looking at the fort. And in our tradition of architecture, it is not just the built spaces, but the open spaces as well that are as important in appreciating the built space as well as in allowing it to function properly. So, in the case of the Red Fort, as I mentioned, the open spaces were an integral part of the buildings, whether they were the gateways or the pavilions or the colonnades, all of which doesn't exist today. And so, how do you present that knowledge? How do you communicate the fact that, look, there is a large proportion of the fort that doesn't exist, which consisted of open space, but it is not open space that is disorganized and amorphous, but it's open space that is regulated and formed. And then again, there are multiple ways of doing it. I've written about it in the book. One way, which some other uh, cultures have also done, particularly in, let's say, in Rome as well, where you give a sense of where the limits of the courtyards were. It's not possible to recreate them because we don't have enough records, but at least if you can indicate that this was the limit of the courtyard, instead of breaking it up into these uh, lawns which are ill suited to, as I mentioned, the climate as well as even the geometry and the space of progression of space. So that's another way to do it, because in our tradition, the relationship between built and open spaces is very, very important. And in the conservation practices that we've kind of inherited from the British, the emphasis has been largely on the built structures, because in their culture, this sort of very, very integral relationship where you live, you live almost in the open as much as you do in your covered spaces, that is not part of their culture. So therefore, there's a tendency to concentrate on only the buildings. So what I'm saying is that you need to actually communicate and reinstate the form of the open spaces as well as the buildings. And then in the buildings, again, as I mentioned, a lot of the Mughal buildings are in a very, very pitiable state. There's a lot of degradation. They're exposed to water seepage. So there has to be a system of prioritizing. And again, all of this comes when you understand what is most important in the fort. So the Mughal buildings that remain today, there are a handful of them. Yeah, they're just scattered here and there in the fort. But they are the reason for the fort to exist. They're the reason the fort was made, and they're the only evidence of this most magnificent palace in the east. So it's important to prioritize them above everything else in the fort. The barracks, or later insertions. They are later insertions. At the moment, what happens is that the Mughal structures are used just as these exotic backdrops. They use selfie points, or they use as for the sound and light show, like a just a backdrop. But the effort is not to communicate what they were like, what were they like, how did they appear, how did they function, and what is their importance in terms of the built tradition of this region. And therefore, what can we learn from them today? Because again, if you look at the architecture that we live in and we practice today, it seems to be completely at variance with where we are. It's not a response to our geology of this area. It's not a response to the climate. We use large swathes of glass, a lot of metal, and a lot of industrial materials, and the entire notion of actually making architecture that is responsive to its time and place is lost. And I think that's a very, very valuable way to conserve the fort, as well as to continue the lessons, into the way we build today. Because it's important not to see the fort as frozen in time. It has, I think it has, we've discussed the fact that for all of us, in our imagination and a popular imagination, in the imagination of the country and its representation, the fort occupies a very important part. So if we can get the fort to function as a cultural center, not just for extravaganzas, but an actual living cultural center for certainly the city around it, the immediate, Shahjahanabad as well as the larger city. If we can, reinstate its social uses.
What exactly would that entail? Would that entail more cultural activities over there, or giving space to artists and craftsmen in the fort?
Both. within the fort, if we involve craftspeople in the
mm,
conservation work, if we can conserve the craft skills and give them a
mm,
space to be
mm,
displayed in the fort, not
mm,
just to make objects, but also in the very conservation of the fort. And then
mm,
a cultural complex, again, that is not just for the very rich or the very powerful, but
mm,
where people can come in. For instance, if and we can look back at the original use of the fort. So
mm,
within the fort, as I mentioned, though there were multiple gates, multiple points of regulation
mm,
and regulated entry, the Nakar Khana was one place where you could, the
mm,
Nakar Khana forecourt
mm,
was a place where you could come, different people could come together. But again, the Khana can again function as a space where you have museums, libraries,
mm,
performing spaces, which people can, they can just sit there, observe, watch. So in a sense, if you've gone to the Crafts Museum,
mm,
something like that happens. You have craftspeople who work there, you have
mm,
performances that happen, and you can just wander around there. So why
mm,
not have something like that? And of
mm,
course, during special occasions, the Red Fort, being what it is, will
mm,
be used for, I'm
mm,
sure it'll be used for, for functions of state importance. And that can happen. But
mm.
throughout the year, why can it not be given back to the people? Why do we have to keep them out? Today, it's extremely difficult to even approach the fort. I mean, you go through such
Yeah,
a long circuitous way that
yeah,
you
yeah.
might as well give up the idea of going
Yeah,
inside.
and as you say repeatedly in the book that people are not even aware of what how grand it was, or they don't have information or they are not aware. So making it into a center like that would bring people, closer to their heritage, and probably even promote not just awareness but in a way to reclaim their heritage.
Yes, absolutely. Because you
Mm,
see, I think that's the only way to actually build appreciation is to
mm,
communicate.
mm,
And if I might just go slightly off, I'll give you an example about the Jantar Mantar, which is another
mm,
site that I've worked on,
mm,
both in research as well as a conservation consultant. So I was a conservation consultant to the ASI for the Red Fort as well, probably the
mm.
first individual, outside consultant that
Okay.
they took in.
Mm,
So with the Jantar Mantar as well, and I remember again, I was there one day, and I was taking some
mm,
observations, and there was these visitors, and they came and asked me. They said, "What are you doing? What is this about?"
mm,
And I explained to them whatever best I knew
mm,
as I could.
mm,
And the minute I did that, immediately they called their children back, who
mm,
were, they were clambering over the yantras.
mhm.
That time you could access the yantras, and they said,
Mm.
"Don't do that because these are very
Yeah,
important." And so the minute
yeah,
I think we underestimate
yeah.
how people will respond, because if you give people
Mm,
sufficient
mm,
information, they will respond positively. They will respect
mm,
their heritage. But
mm,
for the custodians of the fort, I think it's important to engage people, to inform them that, look, this is
mm,
what we intend doing. This is how we
mm,
are hoping to conserve it, and
mm,
um, allow that dialogue to happen rather than just present it as a
mm,
finished
mm,
kind of exercise. And
mm,
the minute we do that,
mm,
I think we open up
mm.
immense possibilities
Yeah.
for this to function as a living
Mm,
space, which is of continued relevance to us. It's not
mm,
just a symbolic relevance or something that you trot out
mm,
on certain days of the year, but it's something that has continued relevance, and it
mm,
has so much potential, as I said, in terms
mm,
of what it has already.
mm. So great. On that positive note about conservation and making these spaces more integrative with society, I would like to say thank you so much for being part of this podcast.
Thank you, Ranji. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I enjoyed our conversation. And I hope I I addressed the questions that you
Yeah.
came to
Yeah,
your
yeah,
mind.
absolutely.
Mm.
And actually, there is so much in the book I would like to also talk about, but of course, we can't make it make the podcast so lengthy as if we are, reading out the whole book or explaining each
Yes,
chapter.
yes, yes.
But
The book has a
I
lot.
would have loved to do a series on this because it's
Mm.
a very interesting topic, and it's also relevant for the present and the future generations. So I hope
Yes.
everybody gets a chance to read this book, and anybody interested in Delhi, should go through this book, I feel.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you think so. And just as a thing that I want to add is that there are aspects of the fort's relevance and which I've given separate talks on, which are
Yeah.
on my YouTube channel. So in case you feel you'd like to access those or
Yes,
get
yes,
your
sure. Would you
access.
like to give your YouTube channel name or any contact details?
It's on my name. So I think if you type Anisha Shekhar Mukherji,
Mm,
you'll get the channels. And there are a series of
mm,
talks.
mm,
A number of them are based on the Red Fort, though there are
mm,
others on Indic traditions
mm,
and the Indian way of design, etc. But I think there are
mm.
at least 4 or 5 that take you through the Red
Okay,
Fort, different aspects.
okay, okay. I'm sure going to subscribe.
Great. So thank you so
Okay.
much, Ranjit. I did enjoy our conversation greatly, and I'm so happy that you enjoyed reading the book as well.
So goodbye for now.
Sure. Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Well, listeners, that was Anisha Shekhar Mukherjee talking about her book, Red Fort of Shahjahanabad, an Architectural History. Well, I still feel that there is a lot about the book which we could have discussed, but of course, there was no time to talk in this episode. Personally, I would certainly like to do another episode on the same topic and on the same book. What do you think? Let me know your opinion. Also, let us know if there is any particular topic or author you would like me to do a podcast on. You can write to me at podcast@raymondproductions.org. That is RAMONPRODUCTIONS.org. Thank you for listening to this episode of Books and Us. If you liked it, please pass the word and subscribe on Spotify, Apple, and Amazon Music. This podcast is also available on many other listening platforms. So keep listening. That's all for this episode. This is Ranjit Monga signing off. Till next time, goodbye and take care.